Just before sunrise, when the sky above Johannesburg was still the color of cold metal, a phone vibrated quietly on a wooden bedside table. No alarm, just a message. Short, almost hesitant. Someone somewhere had typed a sentence and pressed send. Another phone lit up, then another. A ripple. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a strange, heavy silence moving across screens and living rooms and kitchen tables where people were only halfway through their first cup of coffee. The name appeared slowly, like something fragile being placed into the room. Moshidi Motshegwa. For a moment, no one said anything. People just stared, because the message did not look like the kind of thing you read quickly and move on from. It sat there, uncomfortable, almost unreal. Cancer, someone whispered online. That word? The kind of word that doesn't shout. It simply lands and stays there, refusing to leave. And suddenly, memories started pushing through the quiet. A scene from television in the late 1990s. A close-up of her face, calm, steady. The kind of presence that didn't beg for attention but somehow held it anyway. Soul City. Many people remembered that first. Not the awards, not the interviews. Just her eyes on screen, carrying stories that felt uncomfortably close to real life. Someone posted an old photograph, grainy, slightly faded. Another shared a clip from a theater performance. Because long before the cameras followed her, there were small stages, wooden floors that creaked under footsteps, dim lights warming the air, while audiences leaned forward to hear every word she spoke. The truth is, people rarely talk about that part of an actor's life. The waiting, the rehearsals that end long after midnight. The lines repeated again and again until they stop sounding like words and start sounding like breath. That was where Moshidi Motshegwa lived for years, quietly building something that didn't look loud from the outside, but slowly became impossible to ignore. You could see it in the way directors talked about her. Not with excitement, with respect. The kind that comes after watching someone disappear into a character so completely that the room forgets the person standing there. Some actors perform, she listened. That was her strange gift. You could see it even in silence. A tilt of the head. A pause before answering a line. A moment when the camera stayed on her face just a second longer than expected. Those seconds, they carried entire histories. And now the word cancer had slipped quietly into the conversation around her name. No dramatic announcement. Just fragments. Someone said she had been unwell for some time. Someone else insisted she was still fighting. Another voice online wrote, "Please don't spread rumors." Because when a beloved actor's name begins to appear in messages like this, people don't know how to behave. They scroll. They refresh the page. They search for confirmation and hope they won't find it. Meanwhile, the morning kept moving forward. Cars started filling the streets. Radio hosts hesitated before reading the headlines. One station in Pretoria played a piece of music and then stayed silent for almost 15 seconds before speaking again. It felt longer than that. Across social media, fans began posting scenes they loved. Her voice in Generations, her fierce presence in the river. But strangely, none of the clips showed the big dramatic moments. People chose the quiet ones. A conversation at a table, a look across a room, a line delivered so gently that it sounded almost like a secret. That was the thing about her. You didn't feel like she was acting at you. You felt like you had accidentally walked into someone's real life. And that is perhaps why the news, if it was news, felt so personal to strangers who had never met her. Because actors like that do something unusual. They slip into the ordinary parts of our days. A living room television on a rainy afternoon. A late-night rerun playing while someone falls asleep on the couch. Years pass, and suddenly, those faces become familiar in a way that's difficult to explain. Almost like distant relatives you only see through a screen. So when the word cancer begins to circle around that familiar face, it feels wrong, uninvited, like a storm forming in a sky that was perfectly clear the day before. By midday, the posts were everywhere. Not official statements, just scattered pieces of worry. Fans from Cape Town, students from drama schools in Durban, old colleagues who remembered rehearsals from 20 years ago. One former stage manager wrote something simple. She was always the first to arrive. Another remembered her sitting alone in the back of a rehearsal hall, quietly marking notes in a script, while everyone else talked too loudly. No one seemed ready to say anything final. So the internet filled the silence with memories instead. A photograph backstage. A laugh caught in mid-motion. A clip where she forgets a line and then smiles in that calm, knowing way that made audiences forgive everything instantly. And somewhere, in a hospital room that no camera would ever show, the machines kept their quiet rhythm. Beep, pause. Beep! Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor. Visitors came and went. A nurse adjusted something on a monitor. Someone placed flowers on a small table near the bed. The kind of flowers that carry more hope than certainty. Far away, people kept refreshing their phones, waiting, not for confirmation, just for another message that might say something, anything, different. The first lines that appeared online were strangely incomplete. Not headlines, just small sentences scattered across timelines and comment sections. Someone wrote, "Is this true?" Another asked, "Has anyone confirmed this?" No one answered right away, because the first posts didn't sound like news. They sounded like whispers. A radio producer in Cape Town shared a screenshot of a message that had arrived during the early hours of the morning. It wasn't an official statement. No logos. No signatures. Just a short line mentioning the name of Moshidi Motshegwa again. For a while, the internet behaved the way it always does when something fragile begins to surface. People questioned everything. Some insisted the rumor was exaggerated. Others said they had heard something weeks earlier, but refused to repeat it. A fan page that had been sharing clips from the river suddenly stopped posting entirely. The silence there felt louder than the posts. Then the questions started multiplying. Why is everyone talking about this? Where did this come from? Has her family said anything? A journalist from a small entertainment blog wrote a cautious sentence that spread faster than expected. "We are currently trying to verify reports concerning veteran actress Moshidi Motshegwa." Nothing more. No explanation. But that single sentence changed the atmosphere. Because once reporters begin verifying something, it usually means the rumor did not appear out of nowhere. Morning turned into late morning. Editors started calling people who knew her. Producers checked old contact lists. A theater colleague was asked if she had spoken to her recently. Most of the answers were vague. She hasn't been very active lately. I heard she was resting. I thought she was just taking a break. The phrases circled around the truth without touching it. Meanwhile, the television networks began preparing segments they weren't sure they would broadcast. One newsroom opened an old archive file labeled simply, "Motshegwa, Career Highlights." Someone pressed play. On the monitor appeared a younger version of her from Seoul City, speaking slowly, carefully, the way she always did when a scene demanded honesty instead of spectacle. For a moment, the journalists in the room stopped working, because seeing those images made the rumors feel suddenly heavier. By early afternoon, one of the larger newspapers finally wrote the first careful paragraph. It was not dramatic. It didn't use large fonts or emotional language. Just a quiet confirmation that conversations about her health had begun behind the scenes. Still, even then, the article avoided saying too much. It mentioned medical concerns. Nothing else. Readers stared at the screen, wondering why the words felt so incomplete. And then, slowly, more details began slipping out. A second publication wrote that the actress had recently been undergoing medical examinations. Another journalist mentioned a hospital visit that had taken place quietly, without public attention. The pieces did not fit together yet, but they were beginning to form a shape. People started connecting the dots. Fans remembered that her appearances had grown rarer over the past months. A television interview scheduled earlier in the year had been postponed, without explanation. Someone recalled seeing a photograph taken recently where she looked thinner than usual. The internet does strange things when uncertainty lingers long enough. Old images resurface. Old interviews are replayed. Every gesture suddenly feels like a clue people missed. Late in the afternoon, a respected South African entertainment journalist finally wrote the sentence many had been expecting but still hoped not to read. He wrote that sources close to the situation had confirmed a serious diagnosis. He paused before typing the word. Cancer. There it was. Not bold, not capitalized, just sitting in the middle of a quiet paragraph. The reaction online was immediate, but not loud, more like a collective exhale. Fans stopped arguing about rumors. The questions changed. When did this happen? How long has she been fighting? Why didn't we know? Some people scrolled through years of interviews searching for hints that might explain the silence. But those interviews showed the same calm presence she had always carried. Measured words, soft laughter. Nothing that suggested the weight now being discussed across every platform. Soon after, another newspaper added a second piece of information. Her condition, they wrote carefully, had become serious in recent weeks. Again, the article avoided drama. But the tone had shifted. Readers could feel it between the lines. This was no longer speculation. Something real had been unfolding quietly behind hospital doors, while the rest of the world kept watching reruns of her performances in generations. And suddenly, those scenes felt different. Lines that once sounded like ordinary dialogue now carried a strange echo. Fans began posting them again, not with excitement this time, but with a kind of reverence. As evening approached, the first television bulletin mentioned the story briefly at the end of a broadcast. The presenter spoke slowly, not announcing tragedy, just acknowledging concern. And across the country, people sitting in quiet living rooms listened to the name of Moshidi Motshegwa spoken on air again, this time with the fragile understanding that the rumors from the morning had not been simple misunderstandings after all. Somewhere outside, the sun was already disappearing behind the buildings. Phones kept lighting up, messages arriving one after another. Not loud messages, just the kind people send when they don't quite know what to say yet. Long before the messages, before the hospital corridors, before the quiet word cancer began appearing in headlines. There was a different memory people kept returning to, a much older one, not something written in biographies or awards lists. Just a moment. A television screen glowing softly in a living room sometime in the late 1990s. The curtains half closed. The sound of evening traffic outside. Someone flipping through channels, stopping only because a scene had already started. And there she was, Moshidi Motshegwa. No dramatic entrance, no music announcing her presence. She was simply sitting at a table in a scene from Soul City, listening to another character speak. That was it. Yet people remember that moment strangely clearly, because she didn't perform the way television actors often do. She didn't rush. She allowed silence to stay in the room. Her eyes moved slowly, as if she was measuring every word being said before deciding whether to answer. Somewhere in a small house in Soweto, a woman watching the show leaned closer to the screen without realizing it. In Durban, a teenage drama student sat cross-legged on the floor and stopped eating halfway through a bowl of cereal. Even people who couldn't explain why suddenly felt something shift in the air of the room. Not excitement, something quieter. Recognition. It was the feeling of seeing a person who seemed real inside a story that might otherwise have felt like fiction. And from that moment forward, audiences started noticing her everywhere. Sometimes in small roles, sometimes in scenes where she spoke only a few lines. But even then, the camera seemed to linger around her just a little longer than expected. Directors trusted that stillness. Because when Moshidi Motshegwa appeared on screen, something subtle happened to the audience. They leaned forward, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried the quiet gravity of someone who understood the weight of ordinary lives. Years later, another memory formed. This one inside a theater, where the lights dimmed slowly until the entire room disappeared into darkness. Then a single spotlight opened, and she stepped into it. No elaborate costume, just a simple dress, the stage floor echoing lightly beneath her footsteps. The audience didn't clap immediately. They watched. Because there was something about the way she stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely folded, that suggested the story about to unfold would not be loud. It would be personal. And when she spoke the first line, the room changed. Not with applause, with attention. The kind of attention people give when they feel someone is telling a truth they recognize, but rarely hear spoken out loud. Later, that performance would be mentioned in reviews. Critics wrote about the emotional precision she brought to the role. But the people sitting in those theater seats remember something simpler. They remember leaving the building quietly afterward, not rushing to discuss the play, just walking through the cool night air, carrying a strange heaviness that only powerful performances leave behind. Another moment comes from television again, a scene from Generations. Her character stands near a window, speaking to someone who refuses to look at her. The dialogue is calm, almost ordinary. But halfway through the conversation, her voice breaks, just slightly. So slightly that many viewers wondered later if it had been scripted, or if it had simply happened in the moment. That tiny crack in her voice traveled through living rooms across the country, because it sounded exactly like the way real people lose their composure when trying not to cry. And suddenly, thousands of viewers felt as though they were no longer watching television. They were witnessing something painfully familiar. That was the strange power she carried throughout her career. Not spectacle, recognition. When Moshidi Motshegwa appeared in a scene, people didn't feel like they were observing a star. They felt like they were seeing someone who might exist just down the street. A teacher, a neighbor, a woman sitting quietly on a bus looking out the window while the city moves past her. Even in later years, when she appeared in The River, that same quiet authority remained. The characters around her might shout or argue or collapse into dramatic confrontations, but she rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Sometimes all she had to do was turn her head slightly, letting silence fall between sentences, and the entire scene shifted toward her. Audiences noticed it without knowing why. Directors noticed it immediately. And somewhere, many years earlier, that teenage drama student from Durban, who had once paused mid-bite while watching Soul City, would later tell friends that the moment she first saw Moshidi Motshegwa on screen was the moment she realized acting could be something different, something quieter, something truer. And now, as the news about her illness continued spreading through newspapers and late-night broadcasts, those memories began resurfacing everywhere. Clips, old interviews, fragments of scenes people had not watched in years, each one carrying the same unmistakable presence, the same calm intensity that had once filled theaters and television screens. And suddenly, it felt as if time itself had slowed, pausing over those images of her standing beneath stage lights or sitting in a quiet scene. Moments that audiences across South Africa had once witnessed without realizing they would one day return to them with such careful attention. At first, no one called it an illness. Not publicly. Not even among the people who worked closest with Moshidi Motshegwa. They used softer words. Tired. Taking time off. Just resting for a while. The kind of phrases people choose when something feels wrong, but no one wants to name it yet. Months earlier, during a quiet afternoon rehearsal for a television project, one of the younger actors noticed something small, nothing dramatic, just a pause, a longer pause than usual. She had been reading through a scene, holding the script loosely in one hand. The room was warm, the lights slightly too bright, the familiar smell of stage dust floating in the air. Halfway through a line, she stopped. Not because she forgot the words. She simply closed her eyes for a moment that stretched just a little longer than expected. Someone asked gently, "Are you okay?" She nodded. Of course she nodded. That was always her way. Quiet, composed, unwilling to let discomfort interrupt the rhythm of work. But small changes began appearing after that. She canceled a meeting that had been planned weeks earlier. Then another, On the set of The River, a producer later remembered how she sometimes stepped outside between scenes, leaning lightly against the wall near the dressing rooms where the afternoon sun reached the concrete floor. Not complaining, just breathing slowly. A makeup artist once asked if she needed water. She smiled and said she was fine. That word again? Fine. It became the quiet answer people heard again and again. But fine has many meanings, and eventually the routine changed. There were days when she did not appear on set at all. The explanations remained polite and brief. Medical checkup. Doctor's appointment. No one pushed further, because respect had always surrounded Moshidi Motshegwa like an invisible boundary. People trusted that if she wished to speak about something, she would. Until then, silence was allowed to stay. Still, the hospital visits became more frequent. Quiet visits, late afternoons when waiting rooms were less crowded, a scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Dark glasses sometimes, though not always. A nurse who later recognized her from television tried not to stare, because seeing a familiar face from the screen sitting quietly under fluorescent lights felt strangely unsettling. The actress, who had once commanded entire stages, was now just another patient waiting to hear her name called. The tests took time. Days passed. Then more tests, more waiting. At one point, someone close to her mentioned she had been feeling unusual fatigue for months. The kind that sleep doesn't fix. The kind that lingers quietly in the body, like a shadow that refuses to move, even when the sun shifts. Still, she continued working when she could. Lines memorized, scenes completed. The cameras kept rolling, and audiences watching generations or old reruns of Soul City noticed nothing unusual at all. Because on screen, she remained the same calm, controlled presence they had always known. Only the people standing nearby during filming saw the difference. The quieter moments. The way she sometimes sat down between takes instead of pacing the set. A hand resting gently against her side. A thoughtful expression that lingered longer than before. Eventually, the hospital corridors became familiar. The same receptionist. The same elevator. Footsteps echoing across polished floors that always seemed colder than expected. A doctor speaking softly behind a desk. Words being explained carefully. Not all at once. Never all at once. And somewhere inside those conversations, the shape of the illness finally appeared. Cancer, a word that did not arrive suddenly like a storm. It grew slowly. First a suspicion, then a possibility, then something undeniable. Yet even after the diagnosis, the world outside those hospital walls continued moving at its usual pace. Cars filled the highways. Television schedules aired as planned. Fans still shared clips of her performances, praising the strength she brought to every character. They had no idea that behind the quiet confidence of Moshidi Motshegwa, another story had begun unfolding in the background. A slower story, one measured not in scripts or rehearsals, but in medical appointments, long nights, and the growing awareness that something inside the body had changed direction without asking permission. And through it all, the silence around her health remained almost complete. No dramatic announcements, no emotional interviews. Just the occasional absence that people noticed, but rarely questioned. As if everyone sensed that the actress, who had given so much of herself to audiences for decades, deserved the quiet space to face this shadow on her own terms. Still, the shadow continued growing. Not visible to cameras. Not spoken loudly in the news. But present, like a large shape, slowly forming behind a curtain. Something you cannot see clearly yet, but you can feel it there, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. The first messages from colleagues did not look like announcements. They looked like pauses, small fragments appearing one by one beneath photographs that had not been touched for years. Someone from the cast of The River posted a black and white image taken backstage long ago. No long caption, just a sentence. Thinking of you today. And the name beneath it, Moshidi Motshegwa. That was enough. Within minutes, the comments began to gather under the photo like quiet footsteps entering a room. No arguments, no debates. Just short lines typed slowly. Stay strong. We love you. South Africa is praying. Another actor, someone who had once shared a stage with her during a small theater production in Johannesburg, uploaded an old rehearsal photograph. The lighting in the picture was uneven, the edges slightly blurred. But you could still see her standing near the front of the stage, script in hand, listening to the director explain something while everyone else laughed at a joke. His caption read, "She always listened more than she spoke." That post traveled quietly through the internet. Not viral, just steady. People shared it because it felt true. Soon more images appeared. A moment from Soul City. A still frame from Generations. Fans began posting screenshots of scenes that had stayed in their memories for years. Not the dramatic confrontations, the quiet ones. A character standing alone near a window, a slow conversation at a kitchen table. Someone wrote beneath one clip, "I learned patience from watching her act." Another simply typed, "Legend." Then came the prayers. They appeared across Facebook timelines, Instagram stories, and comment sections under news articles. Some were long. Most were just a few words. "Dear God, please protect her. Strength and healing. Sending love to her family." A pastor from Pretoria posted a short video prayer recorded inside an empty church. The camera did not move. Sunlight came through the stained glass windows behind him, while he spoke quietly about courage, dignity, and the way artists sometimes carry entire communities through their stories. He did not mention the illness directly, but everyone knew who he meant. Meanwhile, the younger generation, actors who had grown up watching Moshidi Motshegwa on television, began sharing their own memories. One wrote, "I met her once at an audition. I was so nervous I could barely speak. She smiled and told me to breathe." Another remembered standing in the corner of a set years ago, watching her rehearse a difficult scene from the river. "She repeated one line 20 times, the actor wrote, each time softer than the last." The post ended with only 2 words, "Still learning." Across the country, old photographs began surfacing from forgotten archives. Newspapers opened folders containing images taken decades earlier. One showed her laughing with cast members during the filming of Soul City. Another captured a moment backstage at a theater performance, her face half-lit by a stage lamp, eyes focused somewhere beyond the frame. When these images returned to public view, something unexpected happened. People didn't comment about illness. They commented about time. How many years ago was this? I remember watching this with my mother. My grandmother loved her. The conversation slowly turned into something else entirely. A shared remembering. Late that evening, a well-known South African director posted a single photograph. It showed an empty theater stage, one chair in the center. The caption read, "Some actors fill the room even when they are not speaking." Underneath it he wrote her name again, Moshidi Motshegwa. The comments filled instantly, but the tone remained quiet, respectful. No dramatic language, just the kind of messages people write when words feel too small for what they are trying to say. "Thank you for your art. You inspired so many of us. We are with you." Even international viewers who had discovered her work through streaming platforms began leaving messages. Some from London, some from Lagos, some from Los Angeles. Many admitted they had only recently learned her name, but after watching scenes from Generations or The River, they felt compelled to say something. Something simple, something human. By midnight, the internet was filled with these small emotional fragments. Not organized statements, not official tributes, just scattered expressions of affection and gratitude written by people who had grown up seeing her face appear on their screens year after year. And somewhere in the middle of all those posts, between the prayers, the photographs, and the quiet memories, one fan wrote a single line that many others quietly shared afterward. "She gave us stories for decades. Tonight, we give her our voices." The public knew the actress, the calm voice, the controlled performances, the woman who could carry a scene without raising her tone. But the people who worked behind the cameras often tell a slightly different story when they speak about Moshidi Motshegwa. Not a louder story, a quieter one. the kind that rarely appears in interviews or award speeches. For example, she had a habit that many crew members still remember clearly. She arrived early, not a few minutes early, sometimes an hour before the call time. While the rest of the set was still waking up, lights being adjusted and cables dragged across the floor, she would already be sitting in a chair near the corner of the room with her script open. Not rehearsing loudly, just reading, sometimes marking a small line in the margin with a pen. A young assistant director once asked her why she came so early when most actors preferred to arrive at the last possible moment. She smiled and said something simple. Quiet helps the character arrive. No one forgot that sentence. Another detail people mention is the way she treated actors who were just beginning their careers. The entertainment industry can be intimidating for newcomers. Bright lights, fast schedules, experienced performers who seem impossible to approach. But several young actors who appeared in scenes with Moshidi Motshegwa recall the same moment happening again and again. A nervous newcomer standing near the set, rehearsing their lines under their breath. Then she would walk over quietly, not to correct them, just to talk. One actress, who later became well-known, remembered the first day she shared a scene with her during filming for The River. "I couldn't even look at her," the actress admitted in an interview years later. "My hands were shaking." Just before the camera rolled, Moshidi Motshegwa leaned slightly closer and whispered, "Don't act for me, just talk to me." That advice stayed with the young actress long after the scene ended. And strangely, dozens of actors tell almost identical stories. Different sets, different years, but the same quiet encouragement. She never presented herself as a teacher, yet people kept learning from her anyway. Another small habit, one that stage technicians remember well, was the way she greeted everyone when she arrived. Not just the director. Everyone. The sound engineer adjusting microphones, the lighting assistant standing on a ladder, the makeup artist arranging brushes near a mirror. A quick greeting, a nod, sometimes a short conversation. It sounds like something simple, but in film and television productions where hundreds of people move quickly through crowded sets, that small gesture stood out. One lighting technician who had worked on Generations once said something interesting about her. She remembered names. Not once. Every day. Even years later when people crossed paths again on different projects. But perhaps the most surprising thing colleagues mention is how rarely she spoke about her own struggles. Even before the illness became known, she was never the kind of person who filled conversations with personal complaints. If someone asked how she was feeling, the answer was always brief. "I'm okay." Then the subject changed. Back to work. Back to the scene. That same silence surrounded the months when her health quietly began to change. People noticed the hospital visits. They noticed the occasional absence. But she never turned the set into a place for discussing her condition. Instead, she spoke about scripts, about characters, about how a line might sound more honest if delivered a little slower. During the filming of a later episode of The River, one crew member remembered her sitting between takes with a cup of tea resting in her hands. She looked tired that day, the kind of tiredness that cannot be hidden entirely under studio lights. Still, when a young actor asked her how she managed to keep scenes feeling so real, she gave a quiet answer. "You listen, that was all. Not a lecture, just 2 words." Then the assistant director called everyone back to the set, and the moment ended. Another story surfaced recently from an old theater colleague who had worked with her long before television audiences knew her name. Back then, the theater paid almost nothing. Actors traveled across the city using crowded taxis and buses, carrying costumes in plastic bags. One night after rehearsal, a younger performer admitted he was considering quitting because he could not afford transportation to the theater anymore. Without making a scene, Moshidi Motshegwa quietly covered his taxi fare for several weeks. She never mentioned it again. The actor only spoke about it years later when someone asked why he stayed in the industry. He said one sentence, "She believed I would become something." Stories like that rarely appear in film credits. They exist only in memories shared among people who were there when the cameras stopped rolling and the lights faded. And now, As the world continues reacting to the news about her illness, these small pieces of her character are beginning to surface everywhere. Not the famous performances, not the awards, but the everyday gestures, arriving early, encouraging someone quietly before a scene, remembering the names of people who usually stand outside the spotlight. Tiny details, yet when placed together, they reveal something larger about Moshidi Motshegwa, a presence that existed not only on stage or screen, but also in the quiet spaces between rehearsals and conversations, where the most human parts of a person often remain unseen. Late at night, when most of the messages had already slowed down and the endless scrolling finally began to quiet, a different kind of post appeared online. Not from a fan, not from a television network, from someone who had known Moshidi Motshegwa long before many of the people commenting had ever heard her name. The account belonged to an old friend from the theater days. The photograph attached to the post was simple. Two young actors sitting on the edge of a wooden stage sometime in the early years, their legs hanging over the front, while the empty auditorium stretched out behind them. You could barely recognize them at first, but if you looked carefully, the smile was unmistakable. The caption did not look like a tribute. It looked unfinished. Just a few lines. I remember something she once told me after rehearsal. Something she never said in interviews. Something the public never heard. Then a pause, and beneath that sentence, another line. Maybe one day I'll tell the story. That was it. No explanation. No details. Just a quiet suggestion that somewhere in the long life of Moshidi Motshegwa, there was still a piece of her story that had never reached the public. The internet reacted the way it always does when mystery slips into a conversation. Questions appeared immediately. What story? What do you mean? Please share it. But the friend never replied. The comment section kept growing under the post, yet the original message remained exactly as it was. Unfinished, almost hesitant, like someone who had opened a door only halfway. By the following morning, entertainment reporters began noticing the post as well. Some tried to contact the friend privately. Others searched through old interviews with Moshidi Motshegwa, wondering if there had ever been hints about this untold part of her life. But her interviews had always been remarkably calm, focused on craft, on characters, on the work itself. Whenever personal questions drifted too far into private territory, she had a gentle way of redirecting the conversation back toward storytelling. A journalist from Johannesburg, who had interviewed her several times years earlier, admitted something curious in a late-night radio discussion. She always answered honestly, he said, but sometimes it felt like she was protecting something. He paused after that sentence, not because he had proof, just because the feeling had stayed with him. Meanwhile, another small comment appeared beneath a different post, this time written by a woman who had worked briefly with her on a stage production long before Soul City brought her into millions of homes. The comment read, "There was a night during rehearsals when she told us a story. No one believed it at first." The woman added one more sentence. She laughed and said the world would never hear about it. Again, no explanation followed. Just silence. These fragments began spreading quietly through the conversation surrounding Moshidi Motshegwa. Not enough to become headlines, but enough to spark curiosity. Because the actress who had spent decades portraying deeply human characters on screen had always kept her own life carefully balanced between public and private. Fans knew the roles, the performances, the calm authority she carried in series like Generations and later The River. But beyond those appearances, large sections of her life had remained almost completely quiet. No dramatic revelations, no constant social media updates, just occasional glimpses, an interview here, a photograph there, before she returned again to the work that defined her career. And now, with the news of her illness circulating across television broadcasts and newspaper columns, those mysterious comments from old friends felt strangely significant, almost like echoes from a chapter of her life the public had never seen. One young fan wrote beneath the original post, "Maybe some stories are meant to stay with the people who lived them." Another responded, Or maybe she wanted to tell it herself one day. No one knew which answer was closer to the truth. Somewhere far from the glowing screens and comment threads, the actress whose name had been repeated across the world for days now remained surrounded by a quieter reality. Hospital rooms, close friends, private conversations that did not belong to headlines. And perhaps, somewhere within those quiet moments, there truly was a story. Something only a few people had heard. Something that had never appeared in newspapers, never spoken during interviews, never written into the public history of Moshidi Motshegwa. What the story was, no one said. Not the friend who posted the photograph. Not the colleague from the theater. Only that single whisper left hanging in the air of the internet. There is one thing she never told the public. Night. Johannesburg. The city does not sleep the way people imagine. It only grows quieter. Traffic slows. Street lights stretch long reflections across empty roads. A faint wind moves through the tall buildings, brushing softly against glass windows and balcony rails. Somewhere far below, a taxi passes through an intersection. The sound fades quickly. Inside an apartment several floors above the street, the television is still on. Not loud, just loud enough to fill the room with a soft glow. On the screen, an old episode of Soul City begins playing again. The picture quality is slightly faded, the colors softer than modern broadcasts, but the scene is unmistakable. There she is, Moshidi Motshegwa, younger, standing near a window inside a small living room set. Her character is listening to someone speak off camera. She does not interrupt. She never rushed those moments. The camera lingers on her face while the dialogue unfolds slowly around her. In the apartment, a viewer sits quietly on the couch. No phone in their hand, no conversation, just watching. Outside, the lights of Johannesburg shimmer faintly through the curtains. Cars pass occasionally. A dog barks somewhere down the street. The television scene continues. A character across the room says something difficult, something heavy. And for a moment, the actress does not answer. She simply looks at the other character, eyes steady. That familiar stillness filling the frame again. The same presence audiences recognized for decades in Generations and later in The River. In another house across the city, a different television is also playing. Someone had been scrolling through channels late at night and stopped when the name appeared in the program guide. Now the room is quiet. The viewer leans slightly forward, elbows resting on their knees, watching a scene they have probably seen before many years ago. On social media, the conversations from earlier in the day have slowed. Posts remain, messages remain, but the urgency has faded into something softer. A few fans are still sharing clips, short fragments of performances, a line of dialogue, a quiet look, a moment of silence inside a scene where words are no longer necessary. One video shows her standing beneath stage lights during a theater performance long before television audiences knew her name. The camera shakes slightly. It must have been recorded from the audience. You can hear someone breathing near the microphone. But in the center of the stage, she stands completely still, listening, the same way she always did. Back in Johannesburg, the episode on television reaches its final moments. The conversation between the characters softens. Outside the window in the scene, fictional evening light spills across the room. Her character turns slightly toward the camera. Not dramatically, just a small movement, as if acknowledging something that has been said without needing to answer it directly. Then comes that expression audiences remember so well. A quiet smile. Not wide, not theatrical. Just the hint of warmth appearing in her eyes before the scene fades. The credits begin rolling slowly across the screen. Music rises gently in the background. In the apartment, the viewer does not reach for the remote yet. The television light continues flickering across the walls of the room. Outside, the city lights of Johannesburg remain steady against the night sky. The streets are calmer now, the traffic thinner. Somewhere in another part of the city, a different television begins playing a rerun of The River. Another scene, another story. And inside that scene, Moshidi Motshegwa stands in the frame again. Still calm, still listening, And just before the camera cuts away, she smiles.